So Barbara and I are so Barbara's a principal and I'm a senior manager at Officio, and we are leading our food practice. So we have the privilege of working with organizations along the value chain in the industry, so manufacturers, distribution, as well as quick service restaurants, retail, and hospitality. And I just wanted to start with two big points that are important to keep in mind, which from my perspective is somewhat good news or reassurance. The first one is nobody has nailed it yet. Nobody gets the bounce perfect. And I think you should start by being reassured that it is a journey for absolutely everyone. And it's likely that all our attendees are somewhere on the journey, not yet to perfection, because it just doesn't exist yet. So that's one of the first points I wanted to make. And then the other one is where there are tools out there and ways of structuring your thinking to start progressing. And it's important to know that. And we'll touch on them today. It's obviously impossible to give you all the answers because you're all very unique and in unique positions, and the answers will change. But at least we hope that the tools we give you can help you start moving ahead. So we'll start with a bit of an introduction to remind you of the exceptional context that we're in. We'll then walk you through how to prioritize ESG and cost reduction priorities. We'll move on to levers you can use to combine those in your decision making and how to get both. And then we'll have some concluding remarks and a Q&A. So to start with, we're very much in exceptional circumstances that we haven't really seen before. So we have a market with an unprecedented inflation, incredible shortages in a lot of commodities that we've seen. And all this was from the snowball effect of COVID, changes of regulations, which Brexit is much of, it's very important in the UK in that sense, geopolitical instability, as well as droughts, adverse weather conditions, and animal diseases in the protein world as well. And then on the other hand, you have a consumer that is more and more educated and has ever increasing expectations in terms of the value of the products they consume, but also with where they're coming from. And so they will look for where the products were sourced. They will want to understand whether it was done responsibly. And they're also looking at the contents of what they consume. So sugar, trying to consume more protein, many are making vegan choices, etc. So there are so many battles to pick, and it can rightly feel quite overwhelming and like you're perhaps being pulled in different directions that seem to be conflicted, but are not always the case. So it's really important to take a step back on all those circumstances and try to understand where you can start and what you can do to optimize this balance and find your sweet spot. Just a quick mention of what we hear about when we say ESG in the food sector. So on the environmental front, there's a lot of conversation on agriculture that is sustainable, effective use of water is one, of course. Then there is animal welfare and the conservation of biodiversity, and of course, anything that has to do with emissions and carbon tracking. We importantly have a social area as well, where labor practices are very much at the forefront, wanting to know how, for example, seafood has been harvested, whether it was done in fair conditions, wanting to consume more locally to reduce emissions, but also to promote the local economy and communities, and of course diversity and inclusion, and that will be at the forefront even more in the Americas. And then in terms of governance, on top of this diversity and ethics topic, there's also very much an expectation of accountability for what goes into the product at the end of the day, and there's an expectation that you should be transparent, which obviously adds a lot of pressure, not just because it's there's a lack of will, but it is a certain challenge to be transparent, but certainly something that will improve in the times to come. The first tool we wanted to talk to you about is, unsurprisingly, because we are consultants, a matrix. So we like to plug the cost reduction potential of a solution on the one axis and the ESG potential on the other. And that really helps your decision making and how you prioritize between one or the other or both. So unsurprisingly, there is a no-go zone when a solution brings you an increase in cost and a negative ESG impact on top of that. By all means, diss it. On the flip side, the good news is that there are some solutions that will bring you a reduction in cost and will also bring you a positive impact when we talk about ESG. And we'll comment on those in a moment. There's a bit more of a gray area, which is when you kind of have to choose a bit more between one or the other. So there are solutions that will bring you a good impact in terms of ESG, but will be more costly. And there are solutions that will bring you a good commercial impact and cost reduction, but that may mean a sacrifice when it comes to ESG benefits. And we see three main outcomes when it comes to those decisions. The first one is a scenario where it's not much more expensive to opt for the ESG positive solution. And we're seeing more and more organizations that will opt for that slightly more expensive but beneficial solution. We also see more and more safe to invest programs where some companies will choose to reduce their non-essential costs so that it creates a budget to invest in ESG positive solutions. And then we also, of course, in quite a few cases, still have the outcome where a solution that is ESG positive is still significantly more expensive than the alternative. And so you have to make this short-term decision of economics, essentially. And one topic where that comes back a lot is on fleet and vehicle. There's a desire to move more to hydrogen or clean sources of energy, but it's much more expensive. So there has to be those choices that are made. However, the good news is it is a market that is very dynamic. So if this question is asked again in a few years, the outcome is likely to be different. And that's why it's so important to keep using this to make your decisions quite regularly. And it really should be a continuous target to move more and more of your decisions to the greener and greener areas of this matrix. And I know you all want to know about how to move to the greenest part of this matrix. So I'll probably pass on to Barbara to comment on it.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. So indeed, what levers can you then apply in order to make sure you maximize the benefits of ESG as well as cost control? So from our experience with so many clients in the food sector, we've seen quite a few ideas on what you can do. Of course, it's all down to creativity. There's so much that can be done. But some of the key ideas we've seen is, for example, do the most with what you have. So minimum input for maximum output. So this means, for example, we've had a client where in the sushi manufacturing sector buying a lot of salmon, and they used to actually from the fillet they used to cut out the brown meat part, and actually we've worked with them so that that part is actually reused and can be sold as a byproduct in the shops. So that's one way to say, let's try to do the most of what we can with what we have. Other ideas, so in terms of specifications, so that's a key element there. And of course, that's an important topic in any type of categories you're looking after. But especially now that ESG has become so important, there might be some specifications that you've been working with for so many years that maybe are now not so relevant anymore or have a negative impact on ESG. So that's something you can look at. And an example here given is why not moving maybe to 48-hour delivery instead of 24-hour, which could have an impact on your emissions. We've had another a client whose suppliers, we helped our clients collaborating better. We're going to talk about collaborating better with their supplier. And we actually asked the suppliers in an RFP, what can we do to make your production line more efficient, more cost efficient? And actually, the idea was the supplier told us, please give me more tolerance in the size of the fillets. So which means that instead of having to really focus on that one size that the client was asking for, they had a bit more freedom on the different types of fillets, which in turn, creates less waste on their side. Coming on to the idea of optimizing, so carrying end-to-end supply chain review. This is something as well I would highly recommend you do. So observing all the different elements of your supply chain, and a floor walk, for example, is something that we probably don't do enough, really analyzing how is this all working, what are the steps in order to create the final product. And we've had, for example, a consideration of a client of buying a avocado cutting machine, which is an interesting one I didn't know existed, but was really trying to understand, the compromise between having a team of people cutting avocados by hand or investing, so capex, in a machine that probably you need an investment, of course, upfront, but creates much less waste. There's much more precision in how the product is cut. So this, of course, I'm not saying that you should buy a machine instead of having humans. It could, you have to analyze each case and see what is the best. But that's one example where that really was looking at the whole operation and understanding where do we need to save time and where can we actually save time. Another idea, synergies. So this, I think, as consultants, we are often best placed to drive these synergies, because you really, in order to drive synergies, it's best to be able to step back and have this holistic view on what is happening in the organization. So although there could be simpler ways, so today, for example, maybe with different entities in your organization, entities buy the same product with different suppliers, or buy from the same suppliers, but they don't have the same contract. So this, again, you'd need to have this holistic view in order to apply these elements. But of course, you can create a lot of value in consolidating the spend across different functions or regions. And finally, collaborating with your suppliers. I've mentioned it just briefly now. This is something that brings so much value. So a lot of our clients, when we talk to them, tell us, of course, they are my strategic supplier. Of course, I talk to them daily. But we don't talk about these operational daily talks. We mean really sitting down, having a strategy meeting where we really understand what can we do better for our supplier? What can they do better for us? So you need to keep that constant dialogue and really make it as a project of, reaching those ESG targets and creating better benefits in terms of costs. And the collaboration, really, you can do it through, I said, meetings, strategy meeting, but as I mentioned before, through RFPs is actually an element of a collaboration where you try and understand how they work and what they propose to do in order to make their value proposition more competitive. So if we talk about these other, so if you look on the top right, you see the matrix we talked about earlier. So we just talked about those elements, that how to bring the maximum value of ESG, but also cost control. But there's also how to bring those other boxes, top left and bottom right, to bring the maximum value. So in order to improve that balance, you should try and get this holistic review of the categories in order to identify areas of improvement. So in order to do that, you probably will need to get hold of all the granularity of data, understand what you're spending with whom, and what are you spending all the money on. So this, unfortunately, we see it very often that our clients do not have enough visibility of what they spend, because, I mean, it is difficult. It's difficult for us, even when we put in a lot of the effort. It is difficult to collect a lot of data and to have this, and to also get out of the day-to-day, as simple as that, to sit down and say, okay, where do I go now? Where do I start? How do I prioritize? Another key element, so regular competition between suppliers. This is something that, and I've already touched on that previously, with that competition, you keep a dialogue with your suppliers, but also you bring also some innovation in your mix of suppliers. We have also clients telling us, yes, we bring competition, but actually when you look into it, it's always the same suppliers. There's never new competitor coming in. And actually, you should rely on these outsiders to bring some innovation. They are usually the ones who will disrupt and bring new ideas on how to drive ESG goals. Especially at the moment, it's probably the right time to do some more competition, because we've seen on the market after the peak of last June of the commodity prices, now it's come down and it's at a level that is more workable, shall we say. So it's probably now the time to come back to your suppliers and try and negotiate the prices, because you should expect, in a lot of commodities, you should expect the prices to have gone down since last year. Finally, all of this is should be part of a program. It's not just one initiative and let's just do it on the side. That should be really, at a strategic level of the company to really drive this continuous improvement program. ESG, we cannot avoid it anymore. That it was nice to have some years ago. Now it's not, and we really need to put a lot of focus in this. And it's only, when you really focus on this, when you have a proper program in place, that things can really take off and bring a lot of benefits. In order to prioritize what to do, because yes, there's a lot of things that you can do, this could be a good idea to look at your different types of suppliers. I'm sure you all know this supplier segmentation matrix. We haven't invented that one, so this is already knowledge. But of course, try and focus on your strategic suppliers. So the ones, of course, with high spend and high impact or risk on your business. And with these suppliers, they are the ones I mentioned earlier, with whom you should have these strategic meetings and delivering this continuous improvement together. So really have a discussion. How can we reduce waste? How can we reduce our carbon footprint, for example? So of course, the issue with strategic suppliers is that you're hoping that they see you as a strategic client as well, right? Because if there is a lack of balance there, they might not want to get into those conversations. So the idea would be to try and get them to see you as a strategic client for them in the future. Then we have the other type of supply, commercially critical suppliers, where you have a lot of spend with them, but not so critical for the business. So here, do it really through the competition, through the RFPs, where you try and make sure that, of course, they abide by the policies you have, but also leverage all of these RFP, because this is all benchmark in the end, RFP data. Leverage all of these to understand what do they do? How do they drive ESG targets? And you could get a lot of ideas from these suppliers. Then we have the business critical suppliers. So these ones are the ones, of course, high impact and risk, but low spend. So these ones is the tricky supplier, right? Because we really spend some time on them, but yeah, we don't spend that much money and they could really disrupt the whole operation. So we can, with them, we can ask them, again, through RFPs, for example, we can ask them to help how to drive those ESG initiatives. And for example, asking them how would they help us to drive these synergies. Finally, the transactional suppliers, that's the one you don't want suppliers in there, ideally. So ideally, you diminish as much as possible this category, you remove the tail spend. Of course, it's not always possible, but that's something that can be done. And with these suppliers, really, it's just to make sure that they accept the basics that you need in terms of ESG, code of conduct, could be labor rules and these kind of elements that we cannot do without, basically. I'm going to hand over back to Eleonore. She's going to tell us how can we make all of this sustainable.
Perfect. Thanks, Barbara. And a point on the transactional suppliers, they're like, the more of those you have, as Barbara mentioned, the more opacity you have in your supply chain, and that creates risk. And sometimes that's where some of the scandals we've seen in the media came from. So really try to minimize the number of suppliers you have in that bucket. So Barbara mentioned that sweet spot where you can combine ESG benefits and cost reduction, and how to move as much as possible towards that direction. The point that I would like to make is there should really be a framework to really embed ESG into your day-to-day business. And you ideally want to form a habit to make this not only non-negotiable, but you don't even think about it. It just happens. And the ideas I'll give you, you have probably thought about before, at least implicitly. But the reality is we see our clients don't have the capacity or don't make the time. So I just really want to stress those and say how important it is to maybe allocate a little bit of time in your diary every week or even every few weeks to just take a step back and try to reflect on how much of a habit you're building in your organization. So the first idea to start with is selecting metrics to track. The experience that I've had with clients is that they either do carbon, which is great, it can be measured, or they get very overwhelmed, so they don't really track anything. And because they don't think they can track anything, they don't really do anything. So even if it's very small, even if it's a scorecard, just select something that you're going to track because it will hold you accountable. And ultimately, it's what you want to communicate back to your investors, your consumers, and other stakeholder groups. So you can select other KPIs, just make sure that they are specific to your business and measurable, that they are outcome-based. That means don't just list the things you've done, like talk about the results of what you've done rather. And they have to be aligned to your business and reflect your brand and your operations. We have many examples. We can't talk about all of them in the time we have today, but one example that I liked recently is measuring the percentage of waste that ends up being recycled, which I think being in food is going to resonate with the vast majority of you. Barbara mentioned regular competition with suppliers and keeping them positively challenged. Make sure that's a habit. Make sure that's a habit because, first of all, they need to feel challenged. They need to always put their best foot forward. And it's likely that they have their own ESG programs and they need almost a forum and an opportunity to tell you about the progress they've done. But also, it's a very dynamic market. There are new entrants all the time, and you just can't miss the boat on progress on this one. You might respond with, yes, however, I'm tied with some of my supply chain partners for multiple years. What can I do? And the answer to that is it's not because you're tied in a contract that you can't improve during the life of this contract. So if you don't already have a constant and regular dialogue with your supply chain partners, make sure you have it, and then make sure that ESG is part of the conversation and understand what they're developing and how you can then translate that into how it helps you advance in your ESG targets. And also ask them how they're building efficiency in their ways of working and how that can translate into better commercials for you as well. And then last but not least, and I really can't emphasize this enough, really stay on top of what is happening in the market. It's very, very dynamic. There are new players all the time and they tend to have really innovative solutions and very agile cost structures as well. So you want to be amongst the first to know about those solutions. It will keep you on edge. And again, the more automatic you make this, the more your ways of working will kind of naturally move towards improvement of your ESG performance at the least expense to your bottom line. So take a screenshot of this slide if you like, and try to allocate some time for yourself to move the needle on this. And that brings me to a few concluding remarks. I think the first one is, long are the days where a procurement function was just in the periphery and were just kind of a cost reduction tool. Procurement and supply chain are very much central to anything a business stands for. And however you define ESG in your business, at least 80% of this impact is going to be to your supply chain. So let that sink in and realize how important your duty is, but also how great of an opportunity it is to be in the role that you're in. Prioritize is probably my favorite word of this whole presentation. Realize that I've seen there hasn't been a big bang approach that has worked, because the reality is there are limits in capacity and the market is not ready in every area. So the best results will be gradual. So it's important that you know what you need to prioritize first and move from there. Barbara mentioned quite a few ideas of levers where you can effectively combine cost reduction or at least cost control with a solution that will benefit your ESG journey. Those methods are proven. There's lots of examples of good work on there. They're anecdotal, but they should be generalized. So think about how this can apply to your organization. My other two favorite words are creativity and collaboration. It is so important to challenge yourself to think in ways you haven't before and to have the right discussions with your partners internally and with your supply chain. And then realize that the sooner you embed ESG into your day-to-day decision-making, the easiest it's going to be to move the needle on ESG, but also on getting the best possible value in terms of commercials. So remember those three words: prioritization, creativity, collaboration, and I'm very optimistic that the trade-off will become more and more narrow between ESG and cost control if you use these simple tools. In your holistic review of categories, where should you start?
Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
You can start.
Yes, I would say I talked about data earlier, so you need to definitely get hold of spend data, so invoices, having accounts payable information, so understanding what invoices did we pay, you could say the last 12 months, if you believe they are representative of your business. You could also get purchase order data, so this is more about what did we buy. It doesn't mean we paid the invoice, but at least we bought it. So that could be another source of data. But that's what you need to start with. And what you need to do there is to have a look at it. First of all, who are our top suppliers? Or you could categorize that into the buckets of different categories. And then you see, oh, actually, we spend much more in that category I thought we were. Because, of course, you know who your top suppliers are. Of course, you know what your top categories are. But when we do this kind of analysis, it's already eye-opening, and I think that's a very good start to collect data and having a look at it and analyzing it. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And the only thing I would add on to that is again, when you think of prioritizing, it's important to there's kind of two axes. One is what is the size of the prize and what is the potential of a category in terms of your advancing on your ESG targets and cost reduction, and then what is the ease of implementation that category. So I think you want to find that sweet spot with the biggest prizes, but also you don't want to spend many years getting there if there are things that you can start delivering sooner. Okay, so we also have a question on the matrix. How about cost neutral but ESG positive? So I'm not sure I fully understood it. For me, when it's cost neutral but will bring you a positive impact, it's a bit of a no-brainer. If the question is more about making it cost neutral, then I think that probably goes back to the safe to invest point, where businesses are starting to have more and more of a practice of saving cost on some elements so that they can make those solutions cost neutral or even cost beneficial. So I hope that I've answered that question. I don't know if there's something that you'd like to add on that, Barbara.
No, I think that's yes, that covers it. Yeah.
Okay. Question on outlook for commodity prices for the rest of the year.
I can take that one. So as I mentioned earlier, so we had that peak in the global commodities, was that June last year, a year ago, actually. So that was a peak, and since prices across a lot of commodities have gone down significantly. However, we're still far from the levels of before pre-COVID, and I mean 2015, 2019, we're far higher than the prices we had at the time. But then you need to look into each of the different commodities, because each of them, of course, will have their own dynamics, as we saw in the first slide. So, for example, in wheat or grains, prices tend to go down. So it's actually because at a global level, lots of organizations and countries have taken countermeasures to make up for the war in Ukraine and the difficulties with the production and supply, but also there's been favorable harvests in a lot of countries. So this has eased the market for wheat and grains. However, there's other commodities such as sugar, which are actually going up slightly, went up in the first quarter of this year. And this is due to, so there is, first of all, increasing production, which is good, but actually also increasing demand. So this tightens the market a little bit. There's also been some poor harvest in some regions for sugar. And also there's one element that's going to have a big impact on commodities is the reopening of China to tourism. So with this, we're expecting actually increase in demand in a lot of food commodities in the coming months. So it is, to summarize, it's better than it was last year. We've come out of the peak. It's not going, we're not reaching the levels of pre-COVID. However, it's probably the right time to be negotiating with the suppliers. I hope it's been a useful webinar for everyone. So thank you, Eleonore, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar.